Nuku-Hiva is the largest of the Marquesas Islands, and if you have never heard of it, maybe you should have, because the U.S. once fought a war there. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Following the American Revolution, the young nation was both ideologically opposed to meddling in foreign affairs and strapped for cash. Washington's Continental Army was greatly reduced to just 700 soldiers, and in 1785 the Continental Navy was officially disbanded and its remaining ships sold. The discussion over whether the U.S. needed a navy to protect its interests was a central part of the conflict between the Jeffersonian Democrats and the Hamilton-Adams Federalists. But then American vessels started to be taken by pirates of the Barbary States, and Congress passed the Naval Act of 1794, authorizing the construction of 6 frigates, the forerunners of the United States Navy that we have today. None of the frigates was completed before the 1796 Treaty of Tripoli put an end to the threat, but then came the XYZ affair and the quasi-war with France, and then more threats from Barbary pirates. Not only were the 6 frigates completed, but Congress recognized the need for more ships. With limited funds, some of those ships were built with private funds, by subscription, out of patriotic fervor, and among those was the 36-gun sailing frigate USS Essex. Maritime historians Frances Diane Rabati and James Vescovi wrote in their 1999 book USS Essex and the Birth of the American Navy, given the enthusiasm for the new Navy and the news that the Barbary States were rattling their sabers again, it's not surprising that money for several ships was raised by private subscription. America's largest cities, New York, population 60,000, Philadelphia, 41,000, and Boston, 28,000, responded by building frigates. The town of Salem, which had a population of less than 10,000, but which possessed a seafaring reputation second to none, came through with Essex. Shipbuilder Enos Briggs built Essex. Rabati and Vescovi note that he would build 50 ships during his 33-year career, but Essex, the Salem frigate, was his finest. Essex was designed by William Hackett, who had designed the sloop Ranger, which John Paul Jones had used to raid England during the U.S. War for Independence. She was a stout ship. 7 years after being launched, a naval official would write about Essex. The white oak timber and plank with which the ship was built are superior in quality to any white oak I have seen made use of in the Navy. It appears to have been cut from trees, young and thriving. 141 feet long at the gun deck and displacing 850 long tons, Essex was something of an anomaly. Rabati and Vescovi note that out of civic pride and self-interest, Salem had built the biggest ship it could afford, a 32-gun frigate. She was a respectable vessel, but there was a problem inherent in her size. The British had not sent to sea a frigate of less than 38 guns since 1784. Essex was too large to be considered a sloop or a brig, and not as maneuverable as such vessels, but smaller than both the frigates of the Royal Navy and other frigates in the United States fleet. Still, Rabati and Vescovi note that sailors throughout the world remarked on her speed and beauty of line, and Essex was a bit of an orphan, but the U.S. Navy was pleased to get her, and over the years would make good use of her in a variety of roles. On her maiden voyage, starting January 6, 1800, Essex escorted a convoy of ships to the Dutch East Indies. In doing so, she became the first U.S. man-of-war to cross the equator and the first to transit the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean, returning again via the Cape on the voyage home. Essex served during the First Barbary War, and in June 1805 the negotiations to end that war were conducted on her deck, negotiations that were compelled in no small part by the presence of U.S. squadron, including Essex, outside Tripoli. After the war, Essex spent time in ordinary, but in 1812 the U.S. went to war with the world's greatest naval power, and Essex was called to service once more. She would do so under the command of a naval officer that Rabati and Vescovi described as a gutsy sailor, loath to turn away from any challenge, but whose courageous spirit bordered on recklessness and even crossed the line into insubordination. David Porter. Born in Boston in 1780, the son of a naval commander also named David in the Continental Navy, Porter had become a midshipman in 1798 and fought pirates in the Caribbean and served in the Quasi-War and the Barbary War. He had temporarily commanded the frigate USS Constitution, as well as USS Enterprise. He was given command of the naval station in New Orleans, fighting smugglers and pirates in 1808, and in 1811 was given command of Essex. During her first wartime cruise, Essex earned a special place in the history of the War of 1812. On August 13th, off the coast of Newfoundland, Porter and Essex defeated and captured the Royal Navy sloop Alert, making Essex the first American warship to capture a Royal Navy ship during the war. But it was on Essex's second war cruise, starting in October, that Porter showed exactly how courageous his spirit was. Originally ordered to meet up with an American squadron in the South Atlantic, when he was unable to make the rendezvous, he decided on a daring course, made wholly without orders. he decided to take Essex into the Pacific and attack the British whaling fleet. Writing in a 2006 article on HistoryNet, author Tim DeForest explains, the ambitious captain saw in the Pacific both a chance to do serious damage to enemy commerce and an opportunity to earn prize money and personal glory. Buoyed by the promise of ample prize money, his crew eagerly agreed. In February, despite taking damage in a storm, Essex, which had been the first American man of war to transit the Cape of Good Hope, became the first American man of war to transit Cape Horn and enter the Pacific. He found a friendly port in the Chilean port of Valparaiso. Spain was at the time allied with Britain, but Chile had recently declared independence from Spain and was sympathetic to the Americans. And he further cemented the relationship by quickly capturing the Peruvian privateer Nereda, which had been plaguing Chile. Repaired and reprovisioned, Porter proceeded to start capturing British whalers, eventually creating a flotilla of armed vessels, captured ships manned by prize crews from the approximately 240 sailors plus 40 Marine crew of Essex. Samuel Cox of the U.S. Navy History and Heritage Command assessed Porter's success. Although it took 5 months of hard sailing around the Galapagos Islands and on the west coast of South America, Essex decimated the British whaling fleet in the Pacific, capturing 13 vessels, which inflicted serious economic pain back in Britain in lost investments and revenue. Most of the whalers were armed, some fairly heavily for their size, and some would do double duty as privateers if the pickings were right. Porter captured most of the whalers without a fight by subterfuge. He flew British colors and invited the whalers' masters aboard Essex, only hoisting the U.S. colors after they had come aboard. They captured so many prizes that the crew of the Essex became spread thin, trying to crew all the prize vessels. One of the captured vessels was even commanded by Porter's 12-year-old adopted son, David Farragut. In September, Porter received word that he had become such a thorn in the British side that a frigate and 2 sloops had been dispatched to the Pacific to deal with him. By then, his ships were in need of repair, but he knew that, were he to sail to Valparaiso again, he would face a significant chance of being trapped by the British ships. Instead, he decided to seek repairs in the remote Marquesas Islands. Author Mike Kopic writes in a 2020 edition of HistoryNet, on the morning of October 25th, 1813, the inhabitants of Nukuhiva, the largest of 15 islands comprising Polynesia's remote Marquesas, awoke to the startling sight of a 6-ship flotilla approaching from the east across the cobalt-blue South Pacific. Porter hoped to find on Nukuhiva an island of some 131 square miles, a port safe from the British where his ships could undergo repairs. Essex needed to be beached and have her hull scraped and needed to be fumigated for rats. Nukuhiva seemed a good choice, Kopic writes. Though first visited by the Spanish explorer Alvaro de Mendaña de Nira in 1595, and then again in 1774 by famed British explorer James Cook, the island's remoteness ensured they remained off the beaten track for most Pacific voyagers. Nukuhiva was populated by several warring tribes of indigenous people, generally separated by high mountain peaks. To Porter's surprise, they were initially greeted by Europeans, including an American naval officer, all of whom had been marooned on the island, as well as natives. Cox writes, the sailors found Nukuhiva most acceptable, as the native women didn't wear much and were especially friendly. Really friendly. The Nukuhiva men, however, not so much. In fact, the natives were rumored to be cannibals. Kopic writes that Porter found them an attractive people, tattoo-covered men, tall with chiseled features, and scantily clad women that would turn heads in Boston. The local tribe was called the Tyee. Porter decided to establish a small town near a bay he christened Massachusetts Bay, which he called Madisonville after U.S. President James Madison, and a fort called Madison, armed with 4 cannons to protect it. But in exchange for being allowed to build the fort, he agreed to aid the Tyee chief, Gatenawa, who Porter had impressed with a demonstration of drill by his Marines, in a conflict with the neighboring tribe, the Hapa. Porter had drawn the United States into a war with Nukuhiva. The war arrived shortly after, when a group of Hapa attacked his camp, although they were driven off by musket fire. Porter realized that they would come back and wanted to demonstrate his strength to Gatenawa. He dispatched 2 lieutenants, Navy Lieutenant John Downs and Marine Lieutenant John Gamble, along with 40 sailors and Marines and a 6-pounder cannon, accompanied by several Tyee warriors, to attack a Hapa mountain fort. While greatly outnumbered, the gunpowder easily won the day against an enemy armed with spears and slings, with the 6-pounder used to blow open the main gate. Gamble took a slingstone to the belly, which Kopic notes merely knocked the wind out of him, and a sailor was slightly injured by a glancing blow from a spear. Cox writes that the Americans were then dismayed as the Tyee warriors proceeded to massacre all wounded Hapa warriors. U.S. reports did note, though, that there was no cannibalism, but the Tyee used hapa bones to make necklaces and fan handles. The hapa quickly sued for peace and agreed to pay a tribute to help feed Porter's men, followed by several other local tribes. Porter was also pleased to find out that the natives used whale teeth as currency, helpful given that his was a largely captured whaling fleet. The natives supplied food and helped to scrape the hull of Essex. However, Porter was still outnumbered and needed to stay in Gatineau's good graces, and thus he was compelled to join another fight, this time against the most powerful tribe on the island, the Tyee. Coppock explains the Tyee had been calling the other tribes dogs for obeying the Americans, whom they dismissed as white lizards, mere dirt. Those tribes were openly wondering why Porter did not make war against the Tyee. Were the Americans too weak, or perhaps too frightened? Eager to stay in the good graces of his host, Porter took the 16-gun Essex Jr. and 36 men, accompanied by some 200 war canoes from his allied tribes, to the other side of the island to engage in perhaps the first U.S. military amphibious landing in the Pacific. The Tyees proved more resilient than their previous opponents, ambushing and driving back Porter's force, although musket fire from the Marines allowed them to retreat safely with 4 men wounded. But undeterred, Porter planned a larger overland attack using nearly his whole force. The attack required a difficult mountain climb, but when they reached the valley of the Tyee, musketry again won over spears. Porter's force burned over a dozen villages before returning to Madisonville, and the Tyee sued for peace. Porter and the crew of Essex had conquered Nuku Hiva. Porter claimed the island for the United States. In the end, this almost forgotten and very strange American war that was fought during the course of another war and largely without the knowledge of the United States didn't come to very much. Porter took Essex in search of the British squadron and in March of 1814 was defeated in a fierce battle off Valparaiso with the British frigate HMS Phoebe and sloop HMS Cherub. Porter and Essex were captured. The token force that he'd left behind to hold the island quickly lost the respect of the natives and was forced to abandon the island, and those that survived were also eventually captured by the British, and most of the prize ships that Porter had taken were recaptured by the British as they tried to make their way back to the United States. Even Porter's claim that Nuku Hiva belonged to the United States was never pressed by Congress, largely because Congress was so scandalized at reports that U.S. sailors had had relations with native women. Nuku Hiva and the Marquesas Islands are now part of French Polynesia. After the war, Porter went on to fight pirates in the West Indies and was court-martialed for starting a diplomatic row in Puerto Rico over an officer that had been detained by local authorities. He resigned and became commander-in-chief of the Mexican Navy for 3 years before returning to the U.S. and serving as a diplomat. His adopted son, David Farragut, would become a hero during the Civil War, and in 1866 was named the first full admiral in the United States Navy, a newly created rank. Porter's wife had been pregnant when he left with Essex for the South Atlantic. The child was a son, David Dixon Porter, who would also fight famously for the Union Navy and became only the Navy's second full admiral upon Farragut's death in 1870. One of their first cousins was Fitzjohn Porter, a major general in the Union Army. The family carried on the military tradition. David Porter's great-grandson, also named David Dixon Porter, received the Medal of Honor for actions during the Philippine Insurrection in 1901. The Royal Navy's hunt for USS Essex was the inspiration for historical fiction writer Patrick O'Brien's 1984 novel The Far Side of the World, which was then adapted into a major motion picture in 2003, starring Russell Crowe. The frigate USS Essex might be little remembered today, but it was very much representative of its time, as Robotti and Vescovi conclude. The 32-gun ship embodied the spirit of America during the first 2 decades of the 19th century, when the Navy, like the nation, was brimming with the attributes of youth, righteousness, cockiness, and speed. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.